Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Okay, let's start in Belarus because over the weekend, a Ryanair flight traveling from Greece to Lithuania was intercepted by a MiG-29 fighter while passing through Belarus, and the plane was forced to land in Minsk, which is Belarus's capital. I believe a Ryanair plane, for those who haven't taken one in Europe, it's sort of like the Bolt bus of European airlines, sort of a discount. So Belarusian air traffic controllers, they told this pilot that there was a bomb on board and that he had to land, but we now know that was a lie designed to get the plane on the ground. So that Belarus's intelligence services, which is literally called the KGB, literally still, could arrest a 26-year-old opposition journalist named Roman Protasevich. Protasevich fled Belarus in 2019 in his work helping organize protests against Belarus's president, Alexander Lukashenko. It's made him an enemy of the state. The KGB literally named him a terrorist. So there's concern that if he's prosecuted, he could face the death penalty. The U.S. And most EU countries quickly denounced this state-sanctioned hijacking. Poland's prime minister called it an act of terrorism. President Biden called it an outrageous incident. They demanded his immediate release and said the U.S. was preparing new sanctions. On Monday, the EU said that they're going to impose sanctions on Belarus, including banning Belarus's airlines from using EU airspace or airports. Belarusian state TV released a literal hostage video of Protasevich where he said, he's being treated well, but there were bruises on the guy's face. So, that's not true. President Lukashenko, he's often called Europe's last dictator. There have been months of protests against his latest and, I guess, ongoing attempt to steal this most recent election. On Monday, Lukashenko signed another law putting even more restrictions in place on protesters. I think he banned live streaming from a protest, which is absurd stuff. So, Ben, the international community, I think, is rightly taking this very seriously. They're viewing it as a violation of international rules and sovereignty. But Lukashenko, he's been an international pariah for years. He was recently sanctioned because of the post-election crackdown. That doesn't seem to have slowed him down. Do you think these sanctions are the right step? Are they appropriate? And if not, do you have better ideas for how to inflict a cost on a leader like Lukashenko when Belarus, it's basically a Russian client state who probably is less interested than some other countries in what the U.S. has to say, for example?
Well, look, I think it's worth just noting how serious this is. I mean, first of all, to the global norm, right, that you should be able to get on a plane without fear that some autocratic government's going to ground it. I mean, shoot, Tommy, I've flown on planes that flew over Russian airspace or Chinese airspace or Gulf Arab airspace, or keep naming your 31 flavors here.
Yeah.
And if they're able to get away with this, why would this not happen again? And it's designed to send a message that critics of this regime in Belarus are not safe anywhere. And I think it's even more ominous in a way because some of us are quite skeptical that the KGB for the Russian client state would have done this without at least the knowledge, if not the participation of Russia too. So that makes it kind of a bigger deal in a lot of ways. And then you see this video, this kind of Stalin show trial of this young person who's a journalist, by the way, too. So it's also an attack on kind of the idea of independent journalists and free speech. And so where are we with Lukashenko? I think the first steps were appropriate. And I was glad to see the EU ban flights from landing in Belarus or going through its airspace, essentially cutting them off from the commons of international air travel. And that was a big step because usually Viktor Orban uses his veto of EU foreign policy making decisions to block stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Clearly, there was such overwhelming opinion to do this that he couldn't do that, which is a sign that the EU should do more of this and not let Viktor Orban continually be kind of the skunk at the garden party when they try to stand up for values. I think, look, to tick through the list of things that could be done, you can more aggressively sanction Lukashenko and his kind of inner circle. But more broadly, I think what the US and Europe can do, because we're really at this point, Tommy, where this guy is irredeemable. He's done. We're not going to deal with him anymore. He and his cronies cannot get visas to travel to the US or to Europe. They're just kind of, we're done with you guys, and we're going to sanction you. We're going to try to hunt down all the assets that you launder through the global financial system. And we're going to start doing what these journalists were doing, which is publicizing just how corrupt you are. And we're going to support and show solidarity with the Belarusian opposition, including inviting them potentially to the G7. That's one idea that's been floated, to invite the leadership of the Belarus opposition to attend the G7 as a show of support. and just kind of be, it's not a regime change policy. It's a policy of saying, like, we can't, this guy was not legitimately elected. So he has no legitimacy as president because the election was a fraud, and appeared to go the way of the opposition. He just kind of stepped in. And then this guy won't respect any international norm, right? So we can't deal with him here. And I think something like this deserves that scale of response, because this isn't the U.S. and Europe going to look to escalate. This guy just did something. There was an enormous escalation, taking his internal political disputes and really trying to create a new world in which people aren't safe anywhere, which is what Russia's done through its assassinations in other countries. It's time to just really start pushing back against it.
Yeah, I mean, 170 people were on this flight. So you mentioned Russia's role a couple times. They have been cheering this move and spinning for Lukashenko. The foreign ministry spokeswoman compared what happened on Sunday to an incident back in 2013 where a plane carrying Bolivian President Evo Morales made an unscheduled landing in Austria when he was flying home from Moscow after other European countries refused permission to refuel in their countries or to use their airspace. And there's some suspicion that Edward Snowden might have been on the flight. What do you make of that comparison, besides the fact that clearly in 2013 there wasn't a MiG fighter jet or a fake bomb threat involved?
I mean, the first thing I'd say is I take with a grain of salt the arguments made by a government that concocted this insane story that Hamas had threatened to blow up the plane in support of a ceasefire in Gaza, which already exists. Like, that didn't make no sense. These people don't care about making good faith arguments. They're just trolls, right? Then on the specific, it's a case of whataboutism that draws an incredibly false equivalence. And look, I think you can say that it was wrong to ground Evo Morales' plane, right? And I know I was in the Obama administration. I wasn't in some meeting where we decided to do that, but like you can say that was the wrong decision. But let's be clear, like, this was not grounded with a MiG fighter jet or any fighter jet for that matter. Evo Morales was not detained and arrested and denied his rights. He ended up just flying on. And this wasn't like the establishment of some new norm of, like, detaining opposition figures by grounding international air travel. So, like, I think you have to be able to have two thoughts in your head at the same time. Even if you think, yeah, I don't like how they landed Evo's plane, that's not the same thing as what happened here. And this is what Putin and all of his satellites do all the time, is to try to draw a direct equivalence between these completely flagrant violations of international norms and human rights that they engage in and things that the U.S. has done in the past. I just don't think that's the case here.
It certainly does not excuse this behavior. We'll definitely keep watching this one because I don't think this story has played out yet. But let's turn to Gaza, because there's finally some good news out of Gaza. So the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas that was announced last week has held up so far, and it's ended the 11-day conflict that killed an estimated 248 Palestinians, including 66 children, and 12 Israelis, including one child. Officials in Gaza said that roughly 1,000 residential buildings were destroyed, including several large residential towers. 17 hospitals and clinics were damaged, including Gaza's only COVID-19 testing laboratory. The bombing also damaged other infrastructure like electric power lines, water, sewer lines, etc. There's also, just a lot of non-physical damage, Ben, like to both Israeli and Palestinians. It's harder to quantify. There's the fallout from the mob violence and the fighting between Arabs and Jews in multi-ethnic parts of Israel. Israeli authorities said they have arrested more than 1,550 people who they believe were involved in the violence. I saw estimates that 70% of those arrested were Arabs, 30% were Jews. There has been a really horrifying rise in anti-Semitic violence around the world, including in the U.S. We saw the unraveling of efforts to form a unity government in Israel that might have helped the country to move past the Netanyahu era and forge a coalition of Jewish and Arab parties. So the damage is vast. It seems to be lasting. And all the underlying tensions that got us here around evictions and settlements that kicked off the fightings are still exist, if not worse. So, Ben, last week we saw lots of pressure at this time on President Biden to demand a ceasefire. He kind of got there, right? So he said after his final call with Bibi Netanyahu that he expected, quote, a significant de-escalation today on the path to a ceasefire. So it's not demand, but it's what he expected to see. Despite that readout, a lot of the after action sort of TikTok press stories were all about how this sort of quiet, intensive diplomatic effort was the key to success instead of going public and demanding things out of Netanyahu. So just a few thoughts I had before I ask you what you make of all this. So first, look, I'm incredibly grateful to Biden and his team for all the work they did to help broker a ceasefire. I do think that the Washington press and the Washington pundit class too often centers the U.S. in almost every foreign policy story, when the reality more often than not is that we're not driving the train, right? In this instance, I saw Israeli military officials quoted saying that they accomplished more militarily in 50 hours of fighting than they did in 50 days of war in 2014. So my guess is that Netanyahu, the IDF leaders, basically just hit targets for as long as they wanted to and then decided to hit pause. I guess given that context, you might say to us, like, well, then why does it matter if Biden demands a ceasefire or not, right? If Bibi's just going to do what he's going to do, then why are you suggesting that Biden should call for a ceasefire? And for me, the answer is, to be credible on human rights, you have to be as consistent and clear as you possibly can about your views, even when you're talking about your friends. So I think that's why we were pushing so hard for this call for a ceasefire. So Ben, what thoughts do you have, sort of a couple days after the ceasefire happened, on both that effort and then just the toll that this fighting took generally?
Yeah, I think, look, it's just great to see that the fighting itself stopped, or at least paused, in Gaza and with the rocket fire. That's a positive thing, and clearly the Biden administration's diplomacy, helped support that positive outcome, and that is to be celebrated. I mean, that kind of get in there diplomatically, work with all the countries in the region, the Egyptians, kind of the ones talking to Hamas, and get to a ceasefire. That's all to the good. I do think I had some issues with both kind of the look back at the whole process, and like you said, there was a kind of a victory lap of sorts that you could sense in the press after, which I want to be very honest. I've been a part of that kind of thing in the past, where you,
me too.
You, Tommy, right? Where you put out the best story of what you did. So, but I want people, therefore, to understand, like, to the extent that I'm, I don't know if critical is the right word. I'm just trying to explain some of the challenges with succumbing to the temptation to do that, from having been there myself. I mean, first, there was this emphasis on how the approach was the right one because there was no public pressure or daylight with Bibi, but there was this kind of private, quiet, intense conversation happening, which ultimately became public, as you said in the readout. The problem I have with that is, if you're suggesting that your approach going forward is to be not at all pressuring of Bibi, that gives him an enormous amount of leverage in a way.
Yeah,
he just
that conventional wisdom is pretty great for him. Oh, you can't move me with criticism? Come on.
Think about that. Yeah, like a lot of the DC punditry is like, well, this shows that you shouldn't criticize Bibi at all, because if you criticize him, he might do something even crazier. He might extend the war longer. Just stop and think about that for a second. You're suggesting that this guy can pressure you by threatening to be at war longer that will kill civilians if you don't support his shorter war that also kills civilians. Yeah. That's just when, the logic of not the Biden administration's policy, because this was very much the approach in the Obama years, or at least for a lot of the Obama years too. That's a logic that demands questioning. The same thing with the idea that we heard this phrase a lot, that you put your arm around Bibi to get him to do things. That's never worked. We've talked about that before in this podcast. The idea that you kind of hug Bibi and then he's going to make concessions to the Palestinians. I hope I'm proven wrong on this. Right? Like, let me just posit, I'd love to be proven wrong. I'm not sure that's the case. I'm not sure that's even the case with the ceasefire, because as you said, it had more the feeling like the Israelis had a certain amount of time in mind for this operation. They did a lot very fast this time in terms of the scale of destruction, and then we're kind of ending on their own timeline. So I'm not sure we got Bibi to do something that was that qualitatively different from what he had set out to do. And again, to be cynical, which we should point out, as you have, the Israeli press is usually much more cynical about this stuff than the American press. Bibi served his political aims. He kind of crippled his political opponent's effort, Yair Lapid, to form a government. He strengthened, his approval ratings, and he is going to try to head into another election, the fifth one, to maintain power. And the last thing that I felt a little reluctant about is the ceasefire was very good, but the whole thing was not a positive episode for anybody or anything.
It's horrible.
They clearly didn't dislodge Hamas. Hamas was declaring victory at the end of this thing. A lot of people died, including a lot of Palestinian children. There's a huge amount of destruction in Gaza. There's trauma on both sides, the trauma that the Israelis had from being in bomb shelters, and obviously the trauma in Gaza being through this bombardment. There's this horrific rise in anti-Semitism, which, again, I want to be very clear, like, I don't blame Bibi Netanyahu. Like, if you're an anti-Semite, like, you have problems. If you're like beating up people in West Hollywood because they're Jewish, like, you have no fucking place. You're doing nothing to help Palestinians. That's
you are harming the Palestinians. Absolutely.
And you're only revealing yourself to be a hateful person.
Yeah.
But the broader point here, and then we also see that there's, the tensions have not ended in Jerusalem, and there are these mass arrests taking place. This situation is not better than it was at the beginning of this operation, the beginning of this whole flare-up in Sheikh Jarrah. So again, I'm glad that, like, what you saw is a kind of competent, capable, focused diplomacy to get to a ceasefire. That's all to the good. I was a little wary about the impression that this was, kind of a success for anybody, in the sense that really it was like Bibi Netanyahu extending what has been a negative trend, in terms of Palestinian rights, in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and of course Hamas too. Establishing itself as the leadership of a certain Palestinian faction that is the only one that is standing up to Israel because we're firing rockets, which is utter bullshit too. My hope, going forward, what I hope, Tony Blinken's there now. That's good. Mm-hmm. They've announced that they're going to have a representative to the Palestinian people again, a consul general like they've had in the past in Jerusalem. Trump got rid of that. That's good. It allows you to have representation to Palestinians, which suggests, like a belief that there are people that deserve their own state and their own kind of diplomatic relationships. There's been talk about Gaza reconstruction, which, as has been rightly pointed out by critics, points to kind of the strangeness of giving Israel almost $4 billion in military aid. They destroy Gaza, and then we pay to reconstruct it.
Seems like a bad
which,
deal.
Again, speaks to kind of the madness of this whole thing. But I'd really like to see them follow through on that. There have been some good ideas about, giving people in Gaza more freedom of movement, including the capacity to work inside of Israel, because they've basically been stuck there in Gaza. So good could come out of this, I think, with continued quiet and intensive diplomacy. I would hope, coupled with the occasional public statement of where this is going and kind of what the administration's view of this is. Again, like you said, both for the purpose of speaking to the situation in Israel-Palestine, but also to the purpose of, U.S. international credibility, which, is evaluated on all issues, and in which I think in the present reality of trying to come back after the damage to our credibility of Trump, fair or not, there's just kind of a greater scrutiny when we talk about human rights now than ever before. There always is scrutiny, but particularly now.
Yeah, we got some real work to do on the human rights front. By the way, I've seen some feedback from listeners who say, why don't you focus on blame, talk about Hamas more? And, just the answer is the menu of options for dealing with Hamas is much more limited, a lot less satisfying, right? I mean, like, you can do what we do. You can call them terrorists. You can call them arsonists. You can condemn them. They don't really care what the U.S. says, right? The international community has tried to undercut Hamas by empowering the Palestinian Authority, but the PA has proven to be pretty feckless and really hasn't gotten that much support. The U.S. doesn't talk to Hamas. Like, Ben, you mentioned this earlier. We play telephone. We talk to them through the Egyptians. And I guess U.S. officials could consider changing that approach and engaging with Hamas directly the way we do with the Taliban, but I've not seen that idea floated at all. Hamas is funded and armed by Iran, and the U.S. tries to crack down on Iranian support for terrorism in every way possible, but it's not perfect. And, what ultimately happens is the U.S. support for Israel, the ties between Israeli officials and U.S. officials means we have more leverage there, and that's why those talks become the focus of the coverage. So I think that speaks to why it could feel disproportionate. And as you said, Ben, the question is, what happens now? What is going to break this cycle? What is going to prevent another war in a couple of months or a couple of years? And I'm glad that Tony Blinken is in the region now. I share your concern that the U.S. is greenlighting like $735 million worth of missiles to the Israelis as we're talking about reconstruction. I'm very worried that Bibi Netanyahu is going to run for a fifth term, and he tends to do better when these security concerns are at the fore. So I don't know the best path forward here to reduce tensions and make life better for the Palestinians. What I do know is that we're recording this episode on the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. And over the past year, the Black Lives Matter movement, the protests in the U.S., the series of global protests that we've seen in solidarity with George Floyd and BLM has really changed the framework of this conversation about Palestinian statehood and has changed the focus onto social justice. So that's just a way of saying the problem isn't going away for Israelis. The problem is not going away for Palestinians. But I don't think the conversation is going anywhere in the U.S. either. In fact, I think a lot of people have woken up to feeling like there's pretty grave injustices happening in places like Sheikh Jarrah, and they're going to be more willing to talk about that and to pressure the Biden administration or the Israeli government to try to resolve some of those tensions and just give average Palestinian people a better life, because that's fundamentally the path forward here to disempower Hamas and to make the entire living situation more tenable for everybody involved.
Yeah, and to the Hamas-Iran point, because I hear the same thing, and I understand it. The U.S. does a ton on this, though. We fund the Iron Dome system to protect Israelis from Hamas. The amount of effort put into kind of disrupting the flow of material from Iran to Hamas is really intense. And at the end of the day, some of the components for these rockets are fairly rudimentary. They have these tunnel networks that go into Gaza through Egypt. And by the way, this 15-year blockade of Gaza is, if your goal is to say you want to stop these rockets from getting into or getting constructed in Gaza, this isn't working. Like the 15-year blockade of kind of sealing off Gaza clearly is not sealing off whatever is necessary to build these rockets, and is sealing off basic humanitarian goods that the people of Gaza need to not be living in a way that you would not want anyone to live. It's without the kind of basic dignity that people deserve. And so I do think there's a legitimate question to put back to those people of having tried this approach for 15 years, why not try to open things up and to improve life and opportunity for people in Gaza, give them more connection to the rest of the world while dealing with Hamas in a way that might give the Palestinian people the capacity to make different choices about who their leaders are. They're stuck there like with Hamas. I mean, it's kind of a perverse situation, right?
Literally trapped, yeah.
Literally trapped. And that gets to the point too, like where I think the Biden team may be wary, like, oh, we can't get to a two-state solution, so we don't want to put too much capital into this. You can still do things to address the circumstances facing the Palestinians to try to improve their lives, not just through humanitarian aid, but these questions like their freedom of movement, right? The questions of how they're able to live in Gaza and the West Bank, because as we've all seen, this is a kind of a daily series of humiliations and degradations that a lot of Palestinians are facing. To me, the broad takeaway too is that I've never seen this much U.S. domestic support for the rights of Palestinians. Never mind the global support that we saw as well. And look, I think the Biden team clearly felt some pressure from that, and that's healthy and constructive. I mean, look, part of what happens is people on the outside, I'm well aware that I can say things because I'm not in government, that I couldn't just say if I was sitting in a government job. We all have a different role here. Members of Congress have a different role. And so I think the idea is the administration may, for its own good reasons, be somewhat more cautious in how they talk about this. But there's kind of a creative collaboration between people creating outside pressure, between members of Congress creating new pressures, between global movements, and then what an administration is doing. And you just hope that moves things in a better direction.
Yeah, I agree. Let's turn to Iran, because they've been sort of the subtext of all of this. So we got some good news and some bad news. Good news out of Iran. Iran agreed to a 1-month extension of the Iran nuclear agreement that will allow the International Atomic Energy Agency to continue monitoring its nuclear facilities until June 24th. Bad news. Iran has a presidential election in late June. That deadline is in part why you guys have heard me and Ben express some urgency around the U.S. rejoining the Iran nuclear deal, because we don't know who's going to get elected when Hassan Rouhani is gone. Today, we learned that an Iranian committee, it's this committee of these old geezer hardline conservative clerics that pre-approves candidates. It has that committee disqualified nearly all the candidates that you might describe as moderate or as reformers, which makes it more likely that a hardline individual will get elected. So the current president, Hassan Rouhani, he's a relatively moderate individual, but he's barred from running for a third term. So Ben, what do you think this says about the Trump-Pompeo strategy of crushing Iran with sanctions, pulling out of the JCPOA, and leaving this shitburger for Biden? Would you say that's a smashing success if we get some hardline cleric as the next president of Iran?
These were so predictable. All the things, when the JCPOA was blown up by Trump, like everybody said, this is going to lead the Iranians to resume their nuclear program. This is going to cut the legs out from anybody who wanted to build on the Iran nuclear deal inside of Iran, with the types of follow-on agreements people call for. And this is going to empower the more hardline factions inside Iran who would say, why did you do a deal with the US? Don't trust them. Don't trust the West. Like it's so painfully predictable that this happened.
I know. Predicted. Even by his own staff.
Yeah. And again, having been mildly critical of the Biden team, I just want to say, they were left on both the previous issue we discussed, Israel, Palestine, and this, a total shitburger intentionally. That was the goal of the Trump people, was to make this as hard as possible for a Democrat who would come after them. There's still some uncertainty about what the final candidate list would be, but the current crop is a pretty hardline group of people, that have been around Iranian politics for a while. And it suggests that that's the direction that things are going. Again, I think, which speaks to the urgency of trying to at least return to the JCPOA. So you at least have that protection, those restrictions on the Iranian nuclear program. You're rolling it back from all the progress they've made since Trump pulled out. And then you can see what you can do to address these other issues.
Yeah. Now, the Supreme Leader could overturn the vetting process that basically rejected all of these moderates, but I don't have a ton of hope for that. So we'll wait and see. I don't know. I guess we have another month here because of this extension on the inspections under the JCPOA.
Yeah, the only pressure is that they do like to have some appearance of the democracy to prevent popular unrest, and right now it looks like such a sham. Yeah. The only reason the Supreme Leader might go the other way is just to give the appearance of democracy, but yeah, these are not Democrats. In the Supreme Leader and the Grand Council, which I saw included one guy who's a 94-year-old cleric.
Exactly 94-year-old Iranian cleric. Yeah, I'm sure he's making TikToks and really hip with modern culture. Let's talk about the Olympics, Ben, because the International Olympic Committee, the vice president of it, said last week that the Tokyo Olympics will begin as scheduled in late July, even if Tokyo or other parts of Japan are under a COVID-19 state of emergency. That was a very nice thing to say. So this went over about as well as you'd expect in a country where, I've seen estimates of 2 to 6% of the country has been vaccinated, and they are experiencing a fourth wave of infections that has overwhelmed the country's healthcare system. Recently, a group of 6,000 doctors in Japan called for the games to be canceled, and somewhere between 60 to 80% of the country agrees with them. They want the games to be canceled. It depends on which poll you read and how the question is phrased. So on Monday, the State Department issued guidelines warning travelers to avoid all travel to Japan. They're even warning vaccinated travelers. Of course, there's hope that Japan can ramp up their vaccination efforts. Those have been slowed by basically a slow start, skepticism around foreign vaccines, and then just truly stupid rules that require a doctor or a nurse to be the one to give the shot. There's no rolling into CVS to get a jab from a pharmacist. Tokyo has spent $15.4 billion organizing the Olympics. The IOC gets 75% of its income from selling broadcast rights, so it's clear what's driving this choice. The IOC also said that the number of people coming to Japan from abroad has been reduced from 180,000 to 80,000, and that 80% of the athletes will be vaccinated. But obviously, just bringing in that many people creates concerns about healthcare capacity above and beyond what they're already experiencing. So, Ben, I feel for the athletes here because the IOC said that if these games don't happen, they're going to get canceled. They're not getting postponed again. But man, if I lived in Japan and I was not vaccinated, I would be ripshit pissed. I don't know how you defend this if you're elected leaders there.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you're sympathetic to a country that plans for years. I mean, there's a decade or more of planning that goes in hosting the games. and spends $15 billion, and to the athletes themselves, like we all want to see the Olympic Games. Like I want to see Simone Biles. Like you do just, at the end of the day though, right? Like you have to put public safety first. And at this point, I guess the focus, if this is the way they're going to go, has to be on like just ramping up this vaccine effort in Japan, which should be able to do that. You know, they have the kind of capacity and wealth to do that, and really strict protocols around kind of what the athletes are doing, and you know how much they're you know, it's kind of a bubble situation like what we saw at the NBA. So there's steps that can be taken to mitigate the risk here, but you're right. It's just it makes it appear like the profit outweighed the public safety.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Hopefully they can make good use of the remaining time, but not a situation I would want to be in. Speaking of COVID-19, so the debate over the origins of COVID-19 continues to just rage online and in various newspapers. Here's the latest. Over the weekend, the Wall Street Journal reported that a secret U.S. intelligence report said 3 researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were hospitalized with a COVID-19-like illness back in November of 2019. That would obviously be a very big deal if true. The journal says there are differing views within the intel community over the strength of this evidence. And then the White House, I think Jen Psaki clarified that the information in that intel report came from a foreign entity. So that means it hasn't been independently verified by the U.S. If you want a quick reminder why it is really important for the U.S. to independently vet and verify intelligence from foreign partners, even friendly ones, do a little Google deep dive into the story about how George W. Bush ended up claiming in the 2003 State of the Union that Saddam Hussein tried to buy uranium or yellow cake from Africa. The short version is that the Italians' intelligence services passed along documents to the U.S. and the U.K. Those got bubbled up to like Cheney and the White House. They ran with them. It turns out they were forged, and suddenly you have questionable intelligence as a key part of the case for war with Iraq. Oops. Again, like I'm not arguing that this lab leak theory is in any way like Iraq. I'm just saying we need to be extra, extra careful with unverified intelligence from a liaison partner. So the Wall Street Journal also published a long feature about the way Chinese authorities have been blocking efforts to investigate an abandoned mine where back in 2012, I believe, 6 miners got sick with a mysterious COVID-19-like illness after they had been working cleaning up bat poop. We know that the Wuhan Institute of Virology took samples from that mine, and research on those samples found a virus that was like 96% similar to the virus that causes COVID-19. All of it becomes more suspicious because of the lack of transparency from officials in China, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the government generally. So, Ben, I think here's what we know, right? Like the WHO investigation into the Wuhan lab and the origins of the virus was rushed and shoddy and probably should be redone. The lab needs to be more transparent, especially when it comes to providing information about what research they may have done on so-called gain-of-function experiments, where researchers basically edit or create new viruses in an effort to identify potential future pandemics. We also know that Trump and people like Tom Cotton made getting to the bottom of this so much harder by suggesting that, you know, maybe China was creating a bioweapon and folding this claim into their broader racist effort to blame China and deflect from Trump's failures. So like, it feels like it's clearly wrong to dismiss this lab theory as a conspiracy theory, but I do want to see some evidence. I still feel like if Trump had hard evidence of some sort of lab leak experiment gone wrong, he would have released it. But I just don't know if where you land on the latest iteration of this saga has changed, or if you're like me, just sort of frustrated by the lack of hard evidence that comes out every time there's some big dust up on this.
First of all, like I'm glad you know, look, if the Chinese are more transparent, like these wouldn't be an issue. The one thing I'd say here is that I defer to like the health experts on this. There's a lot of like Twitter, sleuths. And
you don't think Nate Silver's the guy who's in a lockdown?
Yeah. Like Wuhan lab stands online, who kind of grab any shred of information that seems to validate the idea that this came from the lab as proof of their 100% correctness on this theory. Mm-hmm. So what can we do? We should defer to the health experts. What are they not getting? They need more information out of China, which again, we may not be able to trust given how much time has already gone by. but it's worth that effort to kind of go back and do another look at what we know about the origins of this. I think, secondly, though, the U.S. intelligence community drips and drabs of, like what was in the Wall Street Journal, 3 guys got sick, that proves the whole theory. That's not going to serve the interest of figuring this out.
No.
And so I do think that they should consider kind of pulling together everything they know about this, and
NIE, time for an NIE.
Well, it's some way to be transparent about it, right? So that
I'm just going back to the Iraq comparison.
Yeah, no, exactly. I don't want to go, but we don't want to necessarily be overreading like these tiny little bits and pieces. Why not do our own kind of comprehensive? The U.S. government should be able to do a kind of comprehensive. It should do, and I'm sure will do, a lessons learned on this whole thing.
For sure.
So channel this less into like Twitter debates or right-left debates, which makes it's a science, right? Like it's not, it's not an ideological issue about like whether it was like batshit or like
both
whatever,
sides.
It's like become both sides in this very bizarre way. Like let's just kind of like be as comprehensive as we can in putting out information, and then let a bunch of really smart people who understand the origins of diseases like this make their own judgment.
Yeah, Avril Haines, Bill Burns, the head of the intel community. Declassify this bad boy, hand it to us. We'll break the news in a thoughtful, substantive way, and we will not let Nate Silver weigh in on it, or Alex Berenson, or all the other terrible, frustrating Twitter accounts that talk about this all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you saying Avril Haines and Bill Burns, like it does at least point to the fact that having like very credible people who have a reputation for integrity leading these intelligence agencies is a much better place to be than having like Rick Grinnell and a bunch of political nutcases running
Mike
the
Pompeo,
intelligence agency. Yeah, exactly. Like I know there's some people who will just never trust what the U.S. intelligence community says, but like I would just, these people are much more credible. I trust what they say. I trust what Avril Haines and Bill Burns say, and then I'd like to know if their analysts take a full look at the information picture, and like they'll say it's sources and methods, blah blah blah. Look here, like there's a way to share the information we've learned about this, and I think it'd be helpful to do so.
Yeah, I agree. And Avril and Bill are like 2 of the nicest, most thoughtful people I've worked with in government. So I do think they'll figure out a way to do it. Ben, let's talk about Samoa, because we never get to do that. So the first woman elected prime minister of Samoa was literally, physically locked out of her swearing-in ceremony in this growing constitutional crisis, if not outright coup. So listeners will know that Ben and I have already issued a blanket apology for our total inability to pronounce names, especially on the fly when we're just going on the pod here. So I'm going to try to avoid butchering some of them. But the backstory is that Fiame Naomi Mataafa, who is the candidate that won this election, and her newly created FAST party, they had defeated the HRP party and the incumbent prime minister who had been in charge for 22 years. They beat him by 1 vote in parliament. But then this electoral commission said, no, we're adding another person to parliament because we need to meet this gender quota that's in the Constitution, this incredibly cynical attempt to add another member of parliament to block the first female prime minister by citing gender quotas. So then there's a tie. The election is tied again. So then there was a call for a new election altogether. The Supreme Court weighs in. They say, absolutely not. Swear in Mataafa, which, that's where you get to the scene where she's trying to get into the parliament building. She's locked out. And then they end up holding her own swearing in ceremony in a tent on the parliament lawn. So in the backdrop of all this, Ben, which will be no surprise to you, is a fight over how close Samoa should get to China. The incumbent prime minister was about to cut some big deal on a port. The insurgent new candidate says, no, why don't we sort of step back from our relationship with China a bit? Australia and New Zealand are trying to mediate. But man, this is a mess, A. But B, couldn't you see the Biden campaign setting up a tent in the back of the White House, doing their own swearing in? We were about this close to being in the exact same situation here.
Well, look, it's Exhibit Z on the notion that basically there are these common tactics being utilized by people to undermine democracy everywhere. I mean, this felt like the kind of thing that the Georgia state legislature is going to do in the next election.
Yes.
And I do think it's going to be an increasing point of tension as we've already seen the Chinese influence in some of these countries is beginning to create some internal tensions in a lot of different places in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. I think that's going to be another common characteristic here. And so I think good for Australia and New Zealand to kind of be trying to play a really heavy mediating role here, with the goal being like, this should reflect the will of Samoans, not like, some crazy kind of cynical gambit to keep this woman out of office.
Yeah, it's a wild story. We'll keep an eye on it. All right, I've gone a little long, so I'm going to roll a couple of things together here because we're running out of time. So first, there was a military coup in Mali. The president and the prime minister were pushed out of office, and they were detained on Monday. This comes 9 months after the previous prime minister was pushed out in a coup, so not great. A lot of instability there in a country that does not need it. Second, the White House announced that President Biden and President Putin will meet in Geneva, Switzerland on June 15th. I'm sure that will be about as much fun as a military coup. Third, President Biden has extended for 18 months temporary protection from deportation for Haitians currently in the U.S. These protections are usually called TPS. They were first granted to Haiti after the earthquake in 2010. They were extended several times until Trump decided to end them in 2018. That was a horrible decision because Haiti's experiencing this horrible political crisis that has exacerbated shortages of food, water, healthcare, everything, and made the country very unsafe. So I've seen some estimates, Ben, that this could help protect up to 150,000 Haitians in the U.S. from getting sent home. So some good news there.
Yeah, no, I fully think the TPS is definitely warranted in this case. I think on the Putin thing, we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk more about that in future shows. This will be a growing story. The one thing I just noted is there was some really interesting language in the readout of Jake Sullivan's meeting with Patrushev, the Russian national security advisor, in which it referred to the goal of normalizing relations between the U.S. and Russia, which has stirred up a bunch of controversy, in online foreign policy circles, which I recognize are not that broad. But as to whether that's the appropriate goal or not, I mean, I think I fully support what you saw Jen Psaki say today, which is like, look, you meet with your adversaries. Like, I don't think refusing to meet with Vladimir Putin makes any sense. Because it's not like we talked about when you meet with Kim Jong-un, you're kind of conferring legitimacy on this guy. Like Vladimir Putin is going to be around one way or another. Like, Russia touches upon so many U.S. interests, they have to deal with them. And so I think it's right that they've taken some pretty strong actions against Russia in response to recent events. It's right that they want to have this summit. Normalizing relations, I'm not sure what that means in this context. I understand some of the concerns raised about like not wanting to kind of normalize the sense that we're not continually disturbed with what Russia's doing in Ukraine, with Navalny, with what we just saw in Belarus, with cyber attacks. On the other end, if it's kind of just trying to stop an escalatory cycle, and that's a different goal. So I think in the coming weeks, we'll learn more about the Biden team's intentions here. And look, this is a high wire act. I mean, for a team that's been pretty cautious, on the national security front and foreign policy front while they've been doing their domestic agenda, having Biden go into a summit with Putin is a tricky piece of business here. So it'll be interesting to watch.
By the way, do you think in the run up to that summit that the Biden team is able to go to the State Department and find the translator from the Putin-Trump meetings and say, all right, spill the beans, like tell me everything that was talked about and promised?
Well, except there were some times when they didn't even have that translator. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it'd be interesting because I remember that translator. Like he's kind of you never talk to him except when he's translating. But you're right. I mean, you do want to try to figure out like what was discussed in the last meetings between.
Seems relevant, right?
Yeah, it seems relevant.
Yeah. Two more quick things. So about China. So according to leaked documents, in 1958, the United States came closer to using nuclear weapons against China than most historians even realized. So this happened when the Chinese military started shelling islands controlled by Taiwan, and the U.S. military at a very senior level started pushing for a first-use nuclear strike on mainland China, even though they knew it could escalate and kill millions of people and would likely result in a nuclear retaliation by the Soviet Union. But I thought this quote by John Foster Dulles, who was a sociopath along with his brother who was running the country for a while, but then the Secretary of State, really nicely captured the insanity of Cold War thinking. Quote, nobody would mind very much the loss of the offshore islands, but that loss would mean further communist aggression. Nothing seems worth a world war until you looked at the effect of not standing up to each challenge posed. End quote. Whew. The good news is that President Eisenhower said no to these like nuke-loving generals. These documents were disclosed by Daniel Ellsberg, the same guy who leaked the Pentagon Papers, the secret history of the war in Vietnam, back in the early 70s. Ellsberg copied this Taiwan study at the time and kept it, but he didn't make it public until very recently because he said he had just started to get increasingly concerned about potential war between the US and China, especially over Taiwan. Ellsberg also said he wanted to be prosecuted for this disclosure so that he can pick a fight over First Amendment issues in the use of the Espionage Act. I can't imagine DOJ would do something that stupid since this is like a historical document, right? Like this thing should be declassified. Anyway, sobering stuff, Ben. Do you share Ellsberg's concern about these like increasing tensions? And like, could you just give listeners a quick 101 on why people talk about the concept of strategic ambiguity when it comes to Taiwan?
I 100% share his concern. I have a feeling we're going to be talking a lot about Taiwan, in the coming years. And look, the origin story here, right? Taiwan is where the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek went after they lost the civil war to the communists in Mao Zedong. It's an island that the U.S. has basically supported, recognized as China until Nixon's opening to Mao Zedong and the finalization of those agreements, in which the U.S. committed to recognizing a one China policy, that there's one China, the People's Republic of China and Taiwan. But at the same time, kind of the de facto status quo was we continue to sell arms to Taiwan, continue to have very close relationships to Taiwan, and just hope that this would work itself out over time. The challenge is that China's gotten much more assertive here, and the concern is what people are looking at is China's done a massive military buildup of late, a lot of which appears designed to be able to fight and win a war to take back Taiwan. At the same time that we've seen them swallow up Hong Kong with no regard to kind of one country, two systems promise that they've also been making to Taiwan, combined with Xi Jinping just being an incredibly assertive leader who, not to be armchair psychoanalysis here, but he seems like the kind of guy who will want to take care of this account while he's around, as we talked about. So I think you have this basic conundrum, right, where the U.S. has to decide, well, will we defend Taiwan against the Chinese invasion? And this strategic ambiguity concept is, on the one hand, we don't want to come out and say we won't defend Taiwan,
right,
because that's basically like a green light to the Chinese to do this. On the other hand, if we come out and we say, we're essentially going to treat Taiwan like a treaty ally of the United States, that could provoke the Chinese too, and make a conflict more likely. And so you want to be ambiguous where you're trying to create some deterrence from China, a Chinese invasion, without necessarily going as far as giving a security guarantee. I think that the service of this, like, Daniel Ellsberg, daring the feds to prosecute him was kind of funny, guaranteed that won't happen in a way. But the service that this did is, I don't think, and maybe it's something we can talk about on future pods, like, we don't take seriously enough the reality that like nuclear war could happen.
It almost happened in Korea too.
Yeah, just in general, like a bunch of countries have nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan, the Taiwan conflict with the Chinese getting involved here. Like we seem to have put in our rearview mirror concerns about nuclear weapons after the Cold War, or we look at things like the Iran nuclear issue, the proliferation concerns. But this document reminds you that you can get into scenarios where very quickly it's turning to like planning for the use of nuclear weapons, and we should not. That would be such a catastrophic and world-changing event that just because it's not likely doesn't mean we shouldn't take it very seriously.
Yeah, man. And also, this country just had a bunch of lunatics working for it at senior levels at the Pentagon, in the State Department during the Cold War. And my God, are we lucky that we didn't do worse things, because the Dulles brothers, these generals that are talking about like, oh, we're just going to nuke Chinese airports. And then, when they retaliate, we might have to nuke all the way up to Shanghai. Like, you're a sociopath if you're recommending that.
I think in retrospect, Eisenhower and, certainly Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy just from what I've learned from history, said no to a bunch of really insane shit that would have led to nuclear war. So we were lucky to have those people. Not that they were perfect presidents, but
no,
could have been
far from
worse.
it. Yeah. Well, then they also had a literal deep state that was doing things that they didn't tell the elected leaders about. Yeah. Anyway, one more story about Taiwan, Ben, which is John Cena, the professional wrestler turned actor, is getting roasted from a distance, online only because he's really big, for a video he posted where he apologizes in Mandarin to fans in China for referring to Taiwan as a country. This grave offense occurred during an interview where John Cena was promoting F9, the latest Fast and the Furious movie. China, as listeners know, claims Taiwan as part of China, and both the government and the people of China get super pissed off if you suggest otherwise. So some quotes from John Cena's video include, "I made a mistake. I love and respect China and Chinese people. I'm very sorry for my mistake. Sorry. I'm really sorry. You have to understand that I love and respect China and the Chinese people." Very weird, Ben, to hear this like ripped 250-pound man
record a hostage video,
groveling in a hostage video. No, really impressive that he did it in Mandarin. Like, good for him. So, like, the context here, right? Again, the Hollywood Reporter story that came out 2 days ago said that F9 had already grossed $135 million in ticket sales in China alone, hence the groveling. In the past, we've talked about how ESPN, The Gap, the NBA, like tons of countries have bent to China's will to preserve market access and not offend them over Hong Kong or Taiwan or name the issues. So this is why, again, Pod Save the World is officially a Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson podcast, although Blockers was a good movie. But man, didn't expect us to be talking about John Cena today.
Well, this is going to be a growing issue, right? I mean, the extremity of this kind of hostage video kind of pointed up the fact that of just how much leverage China has on anybody who's in their market. And I think, the entertainment industry gets like the bullseye on it for public attention because it's such a public industry, but make no mistake, this happens across the board. I mean, there's plenty of CEOs, I'm sure, who would similarly grovel apologies. And I think it's an increasingly uncomfortable reality that is going to have to change at some point. Like, I don't know how you can have an industry devoted to basically the idea of free expression, right? Which is, we're out here in LA, Tommy, like that's supposed to be the basis of this industry out here, that is so dependent on the Chinese market that there's no free expression when it comes to China. I mean, it's not anybody's fault. It's not John Cena's fault. Like, the Fast franchise depends on Chinese market access. And so I get why John Cena's doing it. It's the structural issue here that I think at some point this industry and others is going to have to kind of really wrestle with, and the U.S. government may have to help figure this out too, in terms of just like, I don't want to live in a world in which there's total self-censorship on issues related to China. That's affecting our free speech in this country.
Yeah, it's gross. It's depressing. I'm sure John Cena faced tons of pressure from studios and others to issue this apology in the same way. Daryl Morey, the GM of the Rockets, got his ass kicked by people in the NBA and by like literally LeBron James after he dared to support protesters in Hong Kong. But you're right that it's gross. It's unsustainable. And at some point, maybe there will be a financial cost to issuing a video like this that will be seen as bigger than the financial cost of not having market access in China. I just don't know when those lines cross.
Yeah, and just think about it this way: a lot like if you're an actor who has said something about human rights in China, say the Uyghur, you've spoken out about the Uyghur issue, you're probably not going to get cast in these movies.
No.
Like, is that fair? No. Like, no. Is that the world we want to live in, where essentially, like, if you just express concern about like a genocide in Western China, that you kind of can't be in Marvel movies or something, or Fast movies or whatever it is. Like, it's pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah, now that's some broken cancel culture right there. Ben, one last bone I had to pick. Tony Blinken just went to Greenland and he didn't buy it. Why? Thought that was the plan.
Didn't care enough.
Pompeo woulda.
Yeah, Pompeo would have walked home with Greenland in his pocket.
just stuff it in your pocket like change in a couch cushion.
In your pocket, man.
Sometimes I think about shit like that. I'm like, man, we talked about the dumbest stuff on the planet for 4 straight years because of Trump and his goons. And it's nice to remember it, but not have to live it.
This is a side note, but like one of the coolest things about working in the U.S. government is like getting to go to places like Greenland.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I was jealous. I was like,
that is cool.
That'd be pretty cool to go to Greenland. Like, when else are you going to go to Greenland? You know?
Probably never.
So kudos to the Blinken traveling staff that got to hang out in Greenland.
Yeah. Shout out Team
Iceland,
Tony.
you know?
Yeah. All the lands. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and talk to you guys next week.